Hello and welcome to a brand new episode of It's Not That Simple from the Fundação Francisco Manuel dos Santos. Today, we're focusing on the power of the European Union, and we're doing it with Finnish-American author, law professor, and expert in international trade law, Anu Bradford. It's going to be fantastic to have an opportunity to speak with someone who's such an expert in this subject. She's quite a sought-after commentator on the European Union, the global economy, and digital regulation as well. We'll be addressing her two famous works. She's the author of The Brussels Effect, How the European Union Rules the World, and also Digital Empires, the Global Battle to Regulate Technology. Anu, thank you so much for joining It's Not That Simple. We're going to break down this incredibly relevant topic of the power of the European Union. So to kind of set the table for us, a general introductory question of how the power of the European Union affects all of us within its borders first.
So first of all, thank you so much for having me here. It's truly a pleasure. So I think I would say first that there are many different dimensions to power. So we can talk about military power, we can talk about economic power, and we can talk about regulatory power. So the EU is not a military power. It has not traditionally been a geopolitical actor, but it is a very strong economic power. It is a trade power, and in particular, it is a regulatory power. So maybe I can unpack that last concept a little bit.
Please.
So the EU is very famous for having the powers and the desire to regulate the internal market, whether we talk about digital regulation, environmental regulation, consumer safety, food safety. These are issues that really affect every European every day. So it affects the food we eat, the air we breathe, the products we produce and consume. So these are the elements that really can be traced to the decisions that are made in Brussels. And that is where the EU has really become not just a European power, but a global power. So the EU is one of the largest and wealthiest consumer markets in the world. And there are very few global companies that can afford not to trade in the EU. So as the price for accessing the European market, they need to comply with European regulations. But often these companies are extending these European regulations across their global conduct and their global production because they want to avoid the cost of complying with multiple different regulatory regimes. So this way, by setting these regulations to the European market, Europe often gets to regulate the entire global marketplace with its regulations like privacy or regulations around the environment.
We're going to get into some of those regulations a little bit later, but what's curious is I think most of us as European citizens consider the EU to be impactful in its territory, in Europe, in the member states. But why is it so influential as well outside of its borders? Because obviously, and you coined the Brussels effect coming from the title of your book, but it's clear that it has a huge impact on what happens outside its borders. Why?
Yeah, so the Brussels effect really refers to this European Union's unilateral ability to regulate the global marketplace. So global companies, they like uniformity. They don't want to have multiple different production lines so that they would produce cars for each different market, or they would have different variations of every food product that they are offering across the globe. So they want to standardize. So how do they decide what is the standard towards which they are producing? Often they take the most stringent, the highest standard, because if they have very demanding environmental regulations to comply with, and they then conform their entire production to conform to those environmental regulations, they have access to all the markets around the world. And often it is the EU that does set that highest standard. So as long as the companies are compliant with the EU standard, then they can sell their products or provide their services across the world. So if I take an example of data privacy regulation, the General Data Protection Regulation or the GDPR of the EU, that has become a global gold standard. So really powerful companies like Apple or Microsoft or Google or Meta, they are now using the EU's GDPR as their global privacy standard, because it would be very hard for them to run a business whereby they would have different privacy standards, let's say in 150 countries and more in which they operate. So this is the logic that often then steers the global companies to the EU standards across the markets.
You mentioned that obviously the EU and its regulatory power has a huge influence in our society, in our culture, in the way that we live on a day-to-day basis. Do you have more specific examples of how it affects the economy and the environment as well?
Yeah, so in many ways, if you think about issues like environmental safety, so the EU has enacted many regulations on emission standards, or the way we want to make sure that the products conform with the various environmental demands, whether it is about pollutants we use or pesticides. And those are something that I think the European consumers would not even realize that they benefit from on a daily basis. They may take for granted that they do benefit from a cleaner environment and the products that conform to, let's say, to the kind of plastics that do not damage our environment. And that is often because the EU has decided to push forward with those regulations. And it has also then been easier for European businesses, because you don't want to be a Portuguese company that produces various products, and every 26 remaining EU member state would have a different requirement on what those products ought to look like in terms of the environmental safety standards. So by harmonizing the environmental protection across the EU and elevating the standards of environmental production, the EU has managed to ensure a marketplace where you can smoothly trade across the EU, but also ensure that all EU producers are then adhering to those high environmental standards. So that would be one concrete example. But if I mention something else, all Europeans love the idea that they can travel across the EU and not pay too much for the airline tickets. And by making sure that through its competition law, the markets remain competitive, then the prices are also down, and that benefits all European consumers. Or then the idea that when you are a Portuguese citizen who is traveling in Italy or Austria or Sweden, you don't need to pay roaming fees when you are using your cell phone.
Correct.
Very few people realize that that is also a benefit that can be traced to the regulations that emanate from Brussels.
It's so important to have that regulation, Anu. I think, especially for the European Union as well, to be competitive with the other superpowers around the planet. But a lot of people would argue as well, and we've all seen memes that talk about the regulatory influence that the EU have, being perhaps also a hindrance towards being competitive with a US or a China in the global market. Is there too much regulation in your view across the landscape when we talk about what's possible or not within the territory to compete with the US or China that have perhaps less regulations and can be more innovative and more disruptive?
So this is really a key question, and I'm really glad that you are asking that. So first of all, the Brussels effect does level the playing field. So the idea is that the European companies would not be at competitive disadvantage if we also have now foreign companies elevate their regulatory compliance to the level expected of European companies. So this way, if you have an American company conform to the European environmental standards and then compete against European companies in the US, their home market, or in China or Japan, then the Europeans would be at that same level. So in that sense, as long as those European regulations get externalized through the Brussels effect, then the European companies would not be at disadvantage. But that said, I think it's still important for us to think about the relationship between regulation and innovation. And especially in the domain of digital economy, there's been this perception that is very common that Europeans are regulating heavily the digital economy, Americans are not. America is the place where all these new technologies emanate, and is then the reason that the Europeans are not able to keep up with the US because they are regulating too much. So I do think that we need to ask the question why the Europeans tech companies are not on par with American and Chinese companies, but I don't think the reason is European commitment to digital regulation. There are other pillars of the tech ecosystem that we have failed to build in Europe, and that should be absolutely the priority. So my invitation for the next Commission, for the next European Parliament, would be really to focus on this issue as an absolute urgent priority. So we need to do a couple of things. So if I mention four, they, I think, should be on the top of the political agenda. First, we really need to complete the digital single market. We talked earlier about harmonizing those regulations across the common market. We have failed to do that in many domains of the digital economy, which means that it's very hard for European companies to scale across the entire EU if they face not only different languages and cultural expectations, but also regulatory barriers. Second, we really would need to complete the Capital Markets Union. It should be easy for a startup from Portugal to raise money not just in the home market, but also from Sweden, also from Poland, also from Germany. And that requires that we have a deeper, a robust capital markets that we currently don't have in Europe. Third, Europe would need to be a place where the entrepreneurs can take risks. But that means we need to tolerate that sometimes the entrepreneurs fail. And we still in Europe have very punitive bankruptcy laws that penalize entrepreneurs if they fail. And we have a culture that is not forgiving, that doesn't give the entrepreneurs always the second chance. Whereas in the US, that is baked into the Silicon Valley's venture capital industry's model. The entrepreneurs try really hard things, sometimes they fail, but they can raise money again. Because we understand that often the hard things do result in failure, and after that, new success can emanate. And the final thing, we really need to be able to, as Europeans, to tap into the global talent in the domain of technology. This is something where the Americans are way ahead of the Europeans. The US is the place where many entrepreneurs come to innovate, they come to study, they stay there to benefit the American labor market. And the Europeans would need to be much more thoughtful in how they create the pathways for high-skill immigration so that global talent will also find Europe as an attractive destination.
That was an incredibly comprehensive answer, and I think it touched on specific areas regarding what the EU needs to do in order to be competitive and guarantee that. What can it learn specifically from the US and China when it comes to their approach towards regulating big tech and making sure that innovation can happen on our territory like it does elsewhere, like you touched on in your book regarding the digital empires?
So first of all, I think the Europeans need to be very clear on where they would want to emulate the US and China and where not.
Okay.
If the Europeans are not comfortable with the business model of Google, this culture of surveillance capitalism where the consumer data is exploited for commercial purposes, I am not sure that the goal ought to be to create a European Google. Or the reason that the Chinese are leading in AI, including facial recognition technology, in part because they are very comfortable with extensive surveillance of their population. That may not be the European way. So even though I say that all regulation is not beneficial, I think neither is all innovation. And I think we would really need to have a conversation. What are the kinds of technological innovations that the Europeans ought to be pursuing that is still consistent with European values? But that said, I think there's a lot that we could learn from China and from the US. There has been tremendous ambition that has fueled the entrepreneurship in those countries. countries. I would say in the US view of the issues that I mentioned, the country's commitment to diversity, being the hotbed for global talent, that is certainly something that I think Europeans ought to be imitating. Or the comfort with risk-taking, the acceptance of failure, even a celebration of failure is something that the Europeans ought to be, I think, looking to with something that we're very comfortable and ought to be replicating. So I think there are certain conditions that have enabled the innovation to emanate from the US, including, I would mention, the close relationship between the business world and the academia that has really enabled for the culture of entrepreneurship to emanate from those academic research institutions and be more connected to that real world where the innovative applications are then developed for technologies. So I think there's a lot that we can learn, but also going back to what I said in the beginning, we need to do it in the way that the Europeans are comfortable, right, that really sort of serve the European view on what an ideal digital economy and digital society looks like.
Yeah, and it's so different, the landscape in Europe compared to the US, if you think that you're dealing with different languages, different cultures, different values, different local and national laws, right? So it's a difficult comparison to make. How worried are you when you look at the current state of the political trends in Europe and the rise of authoritarian governments as well in certain pockets? How worried are you that the continent and the EU is going to be able to stick together regardless of what happens in particular member states in order to be able to stay cohesive and competitive across the board?
So I do worry about politics, not just in Europe, but around the world. So what we are seeing is worldwide a rise of authoritarianism. We see a decline in commitment to liberal democracy. So the authoritarian countries are getting more authoritarian. And we also have the world's democracies that are becoming less committed to liberal democracy. I worry about the US presidential election this coming fall. But we also have many worrying trends in Europe with the rule of law backsliding, with the threats to our commitment to democracy. We have had many member states where some fundamental commitments to rule of law and European values have been under threat. And so we have the rise in far right, the populist parties that pursue agendas that are frankly fundamentally inconsistent with the foundations of the European project. So this election is of utmost significance because we will be making choices collectively as Europe that are very consequential to all member states. And we really need to make sure that those decisions will be made in ways that restore our confidence to our political systems and protects the fundamental values on which Europe has been found. So there is certainly concern about the fragmentation of the political landscape, the rise of the populism, but that was the concern before the last election as well. And those did not materialize at the last election. So I think what I really hope to see is the kind of revitalized interest in the democratic process across the member states, which would mean that people go to the polls, they show up and they use their voice, they use their vote, and really showing that they have a stake in this next election in Europe, and they care about the direction of their own governments, but also the decisions that very much are their decisions as well that will be made in Brussels.
Do you think that there are unprecedented challenges for the EU as far as a communications and influential standpoint when it comes to reaching the citizens of the different countries with the increase of nationalist ideology, with authoritarians, where they find it harder to make their message get to the people who are bombarded with so many different other messages from their local politicians? Is that a situation that occurs now that we've never seen before, obviously with the digital media propaganda that we're all subjected to on a daily basis, whether we like to or not?
So I do worry about this. So there is now so much noise. It's not the first time in history that we are dealing with attempts to distort the democratic discourse or election interference. But we really are now at the era when this can be done at scale, when our relationship to truth has deteriorated, when the amount of disinformation that is surrounding us in the online space, where most of us are now receiving our information, including information about the election. And now we also have artificial intelligence that is amplifying existing problems with disinformation. When we have deep fakes, we have audio, we have video, generating such plausible sounding and looking sources of information that it is very difficult for individual voters to be always certain of what information they can rely on, what is truth and what is not. And we do have now attempts in the European Union to regulate the digital economy in ways that we would have more responsibility by these platforms to try to ensure that we prevent the prevalent disinformation, that AI is not used in ways that undermine the democratic process. But the legislative framework is not yet so complete. The enforcement is not yet at the level that I could say with confidence that the elections are safeguarded. So we do need to be very, very vigilant, both as being critical as voters to consume the information, to verify that we are acting based on information that is truthful, but also holding the platforms accountable. That this is why I very much support the efforts that are now underway from Brussels that are seeking to hold under the Digital Services Act, that are seeking to hold the platforms accountable for any systematic attempts to interfere with the election through disinformation.
Yeah, because in hindsight, we look at the impact that the social media platforms and the so-called fake news had on the Brexit vote in the UK, the US elections, obviously, 2 terms ago. And this is why the regulation is so important, isn't it, Anu, when it comes to the digital landscape, making sure that there is accountability there and that the standards in the EU continue to be at the highest possible threshold.
So absolutely. I think in the US, there has traditionally been this notion that, okay, we trust the tech companies to self-regulate, that ultimately we should not have the governments intervene. But I think these tech companies, they have failed us spectacularly and repeatedly. We cannot trust that they will work always with public interest in mind. They have their business incentives, they have their profits, they have the incentive to promote content. That is more scandalous because that kind of content often gets more traction. And that means there's going to be more advertising revenue attached to the content that spreads so much faster. So that's why I firmly believe that we do need to have regulation and support the Digital Services Act, support the regulation of artificial intelligence that have been the priorities of this past Commission, and the enforcement of which will be absolute key for this next Commission as well. But including already in this European election, we really need to make sure that the election will be conducted with the highest possible integrity when it comes to the accuracy of the information.
We've talked about some of the challenges, some of the threats that are there. What's your biggest hope for the European Union over the next decade? If there's one thing that it needs to get right, and it can get right, what do you think that is?
So in many ways, look, first of all, I am hopeful. In many of these big decisions that we have confronted as societies, I think the Europeans have shown themselves that they have been and are prepared to be on the right side of history. They have been leaders when it comes to fighting climate change, pursuing the kind of standards that preserve our planet. They have been the front runners in protecting the data privacy of the individuals and creating the kind of digital marketplace and digital environment that is fair and more just, and ultimately the kind of environment in which the citizens come first, where the digital transformation transformation is human-centric and where our rights are protected. So in many ways, I think the Europeans have been leading the path that in the long run, when you look back, turns out to be consisting primarily of right choices. I do worry, though, that the geopolitics, the reality, the world within which the European project now will evolve is increasingly dangerous. So we have assertive Russia that launched a brutal attack on Ukraine. We have war in the Middle East. We have growing tensions around South China Sea between the two superpowers, China and the United States. So there is no space for complacency. And I think one big hope that I have for the next, 5 to 10 years of Europe is that Europe can contribute towards a more stable world, towards a more peaceful world. But also Europeans cannot afford to be naive, but the Europeans need to be making choices that ensure not just the well-being, but just the fundamental security and safety of Europeans. And that is a new territory. But I'm just afraid we no longer have the luxury of just looking at the world and relying on the safety umbrella of the United States that is becoming increasingly, I think, uncommitted, depending on what happens in the presidential elections. And so the Europeans need to be able to sort of take charge of their own destiny and not be strategically dependent on the choices made by others for Europe. So in that sense, I am optimistic, but I also think that there is a time for hard decisions, for big decisions that then may call for choices that Europe just wasn't forced to make in the past.
Definitely, the EU has to own its own decisions moving forward. Anu, we're going to wrap up this conversation with a section that we always have, which is the quick fire part of the interview. So I've got a few questions here that I'd appreciate if you could answer with just one word or one sentence. So the first one is, what is one personality trait that a good leader could really benefit from having, and why?
So I think we need responsible ambition. I think we need to really be much more ambitious about Europe going forward, but also understand that the decisions that we're making right now are very consequential. So they need to be made in a particularly thoughtful way.
What is the biggest challenge that you feel humanity is facing right now?
So I would say that the biggest challenge is around climate change. That is something, but at the same time, also the digital transformation that really puts our democracies at risk. And if you erode the democratic foundation of the societies, the decisions we make about anything, including climate, will be at risk.
If you could change one thing by magic right now, or until the end of the day, to give you a little bit more time, what would that be if you could change one thing in the world right now?
So we have wars that just need to end, which is just the human suffering at the scale that hurts to watch on a daily basis. So whether we talk about the war in Ukraine, whether we talk about wars in Middle East, this is the kind of reality that is just painful to watch, and that is what would be the first thing I would change.
Very good one. What is the most important learning of your life and career? If you could sum it up.
Look, I think ultimately there's just so much that I've learned, but I think one thing I probably would pass on is that you need to pursue your own dreams, not the dreams by somebody else. And ultimately, I think that will empower you with the choices that you are making. And that's, I think, one of the issues that I'm most grateful for of how I was raised. I was raised to chase not my parents' dreams or somebody else's, but really do the things that matter to me. And I think that has made my life at least very meaningful and what I try to teach to my own students going forward.
That's what I was going to say. I'm sure that's a message that you pass on to your students as much as possible as well. So important for today's youth to hear that and feel that, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Anu, it was an absolute delight to have you here on It's Not That Simple. Thank you for breaking down how the EU works from a regulatory point of view and continued success in your career.
Thank you so much. It really was my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Anu. Such an enlightening conversation, and we touched on so many relevant and tough topics as we look at this area of the EU and the work, the responsibility it has towards its member states and towards its citizens as we stand here at such a pivotal moment in the future of what the EU is all about. It's been fantastic to have you here along for the ride for another episode of It's Not That Simple.